So my work is really about where are the gaps between healthcare, for example, or education, for example, and this information. How do we get these conversations and connections to be made so that they're accessible? And I would say that technology is one of the keys of accessibility. We already have certain kinds of apps being developed that can curate and deliver a playlist of your choosing that you might choose for calming down, right? But to
Yeah.
understand that going to a live event and being with humans in a room where the vibrations are all set together and in motion for everyone to experience collectively is even more powerful.
So great to meet you here on Zoom, Bama.
A pleasure to meet you. I'm so surprised you found me here.
Well, I find people, that is the one thing. And sometimes people are so negative about social media, and I've met the most wonderful people through social media and through this connection. I think it's wonderful that the world has become so small through the fact that we can connect like this.
I totally agree with that, and I find it comforting that much of my work can be done in this way, and these kinds of connections can blossom and grow.
True. But you have a very interesting path, because from musicology to neuroscience.
Well, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I work with them. I
Okay.
I am a consultant to a health foundation, and again, that's a sort of a transformative jump. The musicology came later, also. So my career started in performance as a horn player in an orchestra.
Really? Oh, that is so
Yeah,
interesting.
what's interesting to me about it is that it has been the foundation of my work to this day. And I did teach as a musicologist and did research actually in Vienna and Prague on 18th century, early 19th century music,
Amazing.
especially Schubert and Carl Maria von Weber. So there's a lot of layers. And as we go along the way, we always add more layers to what it is we're interested in. And sometimes things bubble up that we finally have time to address. When I was teaching at University of North Carolina, Greensboro, we had a Center for Music Research in the makeup of the school. And they were looking at some of the biological impacts of music, listening, music performance, stress on the body, repetitive stress, hearing loss, neural processing. And at about the same time, Wake Forest University, where I also taught part time, was the home of Baptist Health and a very vigorous neuroscience and music study that was underway, looking at the brains of musicians in a functional MRI machine with initially they had like a keyboard that you couldn't actually play on, but you could imagine you were playing on it. And
Oh,
of course, pianists, they memorized their music and they were able to look deeply into the brain. So I had been clued in a little bit to this kind of thinking, and I thought it was really important. It was one of those gaps. And my life has been about where are the gaps, where are the questions that remain. I think that's always naturally curious, driven me toward something. When I left North Carolina with my husband, we moved back to where I'm from, which is here in southeastern Florida. And I went to work in the arts in this community. I live in Palm Beach County, which is a very large county with 40 large cities in it, some smaller, some much larger. And in southeastern Florida, many people know where. And I grew up here. So I was glad to come back and work in the arts here for several years as an advocate for artists and the arts community. Music special to my heart, but looking at different funding streams for artists in our community and opportunities to help them thrive and support their work and in marketing and arts marketing, those kind of things. And along the way, I happened to have a conversation with Patrick McNamara. He is the CEO of Palm Health Foundation. And he had discovered something that he said was his aha moment. And it was called the Neuroarts Blueprint. And it was all about the impact. Neuroarts, I should probably define as a translational discipline. It's transdisciplinary, but it is also translational. It's the intersection of arts, sciences, and technology. And technology being the one most recently at the table has changed the other two drastically. Just this conversation, for example.
Yeah.
But the potential to look into the human brain and to image what goes on in a musician's mind and brain and how neurons are firing and what other reactions or kind of domino effects are related to what you're listening to, for example, becomes a very, very interesting way of looking at health and well-being. So neuroarts is defined as the transdisciplinary study of the measurable impact of arts and aesthetic experiences on the body, brain, and behavior, and how to translate that knowledge into actual specific practices to advance health and well-being. When Patrick spoke to me about that, yes, go
I
ahead.
just want to ask you, the fact that you are a musician, did that also draw you to find out more or to be interested in this?
It resonated with me deeply.
Mm-hmm.
I'm, like I said, naturally curious as a child. Whenever I found a situation stressful in my home life, I would migrate to the piano and sit in the corner and play in my own little world. And my brain was so occupied by musical activity, whether it was focusing on technique or listening to chord changes before I really understood the theory behind them, just interested and clued into it, and then trying to master a beautiful piece of music, and then imagining all kinds of things. So yes, and I always sang as a child. So those things were part of my DNA, you might say. But they were also part of my adult love of the arts. And when I look back on my career, one of my very happiest memories is sitting on a stage with an orchestra and playing together with other human beings in this perfect synchrony to create something that others in the audience are going to enjoy and experience. So that business about what's going on in our brain as human beings when this happens is a very rich question. And of course, neuroscience tends to look at what's going on in the brain, but not necessarily in this vein. And that's where neuroarts comes together.
That's so interesting also that you mentioned now about your happiest place was in the orchestra, and that it's that togetherness, that being with other musicians, being with people who almost think the same as you do, or and you are all creators, really.
We're co-creators in that moment. And it's a joyful experience. Everything else gets put aside. I think the idea of wellness and health, including mental health for our communities and our societies writ large, whatever culture we're from, that the arts have always been embraced in this way for peacemaking, for thriving, for celebrating, for galvanizing us in our identities. And I had to sort of subjectively consult my gut and say, when was that you felt that sense of belonging, so uncluttered by conflict and uncluttered by worries? And it was in that moment, and that again fueled further questions. The other reason is I went on to become a musicologist was because I'm so curious, always wanting
Okay.
run down a rabbit hole and find an answer. Why did Schubert write it that way? What was he doing that day? What was his life like? Those kinds of questions pop up, and the beauty of being free to pursue them is an art form in and of itself. Being free to just allow yourself to go down that rabbit trail and follow where it will lead you. And what will you discover? Those are things that fuel me.
But do you think, talking about the wellness aspect of the arts, uh, that we've also almost moved so far away from art in education that we focus now on trying to resolve the children's wellness by other means rather than going back to this very natural creativeness inside us to give them the opportunity, because it's almost as if you think, like you were saying about an orchestra, that if we can put children in these situations as if it's almost naturally for them to find themselves, to find their own purpose, and that then creates the wellness aspect.
I do, and I'm really happy to hear you articulate that question so beautifully. I think all of us in our childhood have to learn to navigate, have to learn friend or foe. Our brains are wired to help us express our needs, but also to help us assess our situation and to learn what stress is, which causes sickness in our bodies. And over time, that can be very, very serious. I think to learn how to care for ourselves isn't taught in the same way, that somehow we separate things. We separate education, mathematics, language, sciences, and that they shall never meet. And the arts are over here, and then there's visual art, and then there's music, and then there's dance, but they don't even bother with that at school. One of the strongest ways we're learning from neuroscience for people to keep their brain healthy is to dance. It
And
requires,
it's yeah.
cross-motor referencing. It requires us to remember steps and to stay in time and invoke rhythmic entrainment and follow along with music and process our partner's moves or our people in a group. It also brings us into belonging and into rhythm with others, much like playing in an orchestra. And so I think if we could get back to those kinds of children's games traditionally that were taught, think of folk dance.
Yeah.
Think about that. Children learn that from their parents early on, but we don't practice that so much anymore. It's in the modern world, we have separated ourselves. And that, I think, to our own demise and to the demise of these poor children who are now over technology and under arted, if you will.
Thinking now of this wonderful project that we have here at the Musikverein in Vienna, where they have concerts for people with dementia, and they allow the people to get up and start dancing if they feel like it. And people do. And how amazing, that the music can, even in these cases of people with dementia, that they can spontaneously just get up and start dancing.
That is part of the brain that is always strong. Right up until the end of our lives, we can hear music and respond to it. And if we remember it from our young adulthood, when we're deciding who we're going to be, now that we're launching out of the nest as young adults, that's the music that stays with us until the end and can be activated, even when our conscious memory is not working well. That memory is there, and it's very powerful and very positive. And it relieves a great deal of suffering.
And isn't it also true that by pursuing a form of art, and I'm not talking about just people at a very high level of, say, musicians or ballet dancers. I'm just talking about if we could give children the opportunity to pursue and to create, that this also brings with it all these transferable skills that they can take into other aspects of their lives.
Absolutely, it does. And I believe this conversation and others like it need to keep happening until people become so fully aware of how ultimately important our expression is. And dance is self-expression. Music is self-expression. Writing, poetry, drawing, spoken word, songwriting, all self-expression, and it doesn't mean that you're at this level of the artist, somehow, the virtuoso. It means that you are human, and therefore you will sing. You are human, and you will enjoy moving and dancing in rhythm. Try not to tap your feet. You're
Yeah.
wired for it. You're
Mhm.
wired for it. So when you allow yourself to be human, and this is the nature of the work I'm doing, to bring this understanding of the connection between arts, science, and technology about how we're wired for the arts and how that can be applied to heal us, to help us be strong and healthy, to really keep our brain in tip top form. The more we do that in a community, it needs to be embraced by the institutions that have separated it in the first place. So
Mhm.
my work is really about where are the gaps between healthcare, for example, or education, for example, and this information. How do we get these conversations and connections to be made so that they're accessible? And I would say that technology is one of the keys of accessibility. We already have certain kinds of apps being developed that can curate and deliver a playlist of your choosing that you might choose for calming down, right? But to
Yeah.
understand that going to a live event and being with humans in a room where the vibrations are all set together and in motion for everyone to experience collectively is even more powerful. And it helps with things like anxiety and depression and loneliness and social isolation. It's very, very healthy, even if your brain isn't altogether healthy, even if you're at the Musikverein with dementia. It
Yeah.
brings you back into community, which is how we survive and thrive as human beings. So it is a really important avenue to pursue.
Mm. It's interesting that you talk about this vibration. I did interviews with artists over lockdown who were in quarantine sometimes, or it's somewhere where they could perform, but then it was just a live stream, so there wasn't an audience. And all of them said to me that the sound is so different and that the feeling for the artist was so different performing in this empty hall. And I never realized that this, I always thought, yes, the energy comes from the stage, but I never realized that the artist also take the energy from the audience, and that's this play in between of audience and stage, this energy play.
That connection is everything.
Mm.
And the buildings themselves are designed to reflect those energies back into the whole. Where are the people? They design it so the vibrations are focused and coming to those chairs and to that stage. It wouldn't do if you had an orchestral stage set up where the acoustics from the musicians couldn't really, they couldn't hear themselves. They have to hear themselves in order to play together. And if the audience couldn't hear well, there would be some very empty seats because the listening experience was subpar.
Mm.
Um, when I take that obvious kind of example and spin it out into our world today as sort of a consumer receiver model of the arts experience, and I think of where is art being distributed, because that's a question I have in my community where I live. Where do people go to get their art experience? Just ordinary people that may decide they want to pursue a concert experience. There are dedicated performance halls. There are bars and social environments where people go to hear a particular band or musician perform. Hotels. There are different spaces, but oftentimes I think there's a layer of culture that is something we really have to tackle. That says it's for consuming alcohol or for making a dollar, or it's
Yeah.
a more of a model of exploiting the art instead of realizing the health benefits of the art, and that's where these conversations need to elevate artists. And that's one of the reasons I got involved so much with the Neuroarts blueprint, because the Palm Health Foundation is focused very much on delivering a community of health at the broadest level here in southeastern Florida. Social workers, educators, behavioral health professionals, medical doctors, pain management, Alzheimer's. We have a great number of retirees and people who, as they age, show signs of dementia, Alzheimer's, or Parkinson's, or other neurodegenerative disorders. And the care for them almost always, they'll thrive. They'll live a better quality of life. It's a much better situation for an overstressed caregiver if you introduce these arts-based practices in a meaningful way and make them available. So I think consciousness of this is because we're wired to do this. And we've not been doing it. We've allowed the stress, the stress is way up here in our lives, but the release valve, the soothing, the healing from that is much slower in being realized. So that's the nature of developing a community of health is you have to get universities to speak with educators, to speak with artists. You need artists to inform neuroscientists about what art really means to them and how they practice art. And those conversations, thanks to the Neuroarts blueprint, that's what Neuroarts creates a space for.
And it comes back always for me to the fact that children don't get the opportunity to do art in schools, because I think even any form of art that you do makes you also appreciate that form of art. So that's also what then would bring back the value of art. I think this is this whole cycle that we have to start in the education system and make art such a great priority so that parents and children could understand the value of it.
It's interesting in Palm Beach County when we started developing that. I'm going to grab a book here and show you something. We started developing the idea of embracing the Neuroarts blueprint and implementing it locally. And we were among the very first communities to do that here. And one of the things that the foundation did is they invested in, I don't know if you mind if I show it, Susan Magsalmon and Ivy Ross's book, Your Brain on Art.
I have it.
Do you? Yeah, I don't know if we can see it here somewhere, yeah. And they bought 200 copies, which I thought was kind of a genius idea, is
yes,
somehow people will legitimize the arts if they know the science behind it, and then the conversation has begun. And so that seeded in a very healthy way a number of conversations. Later on, our Palm Beach County school district's behavioral health professionals, one in every school, came together as a department, 180 of them, and asked if we could work with them. And they were given copies of the book, which they read every month in cohorts. There are 180, so they divided themselves up in cohorts of 60. And every month they would read a certain number of chapters and discuss it together, how it might relate to their practice of working with children at primary, middle, and high schools in the community. And then they did a 3-day seminar over the summer, workshopping practices like songwriting and using art to help children express themselves, to write poetry, to find their words, things like that. And so they've been really not only excited about it, but committed to it. And I do think sometimes you have to go by who's going to be your best advocate, that they're some of our best advocates because they are behavioral health specialists in each school. They deal with these children directly. How that translates, unfortunately, because things are so separated out in our world these days, you have to still convince the curricula people that art teacher is extremely important to these children. Yeah. And we're fortunate that Palm Beach County does have a commitment, and many of our local artists migrated into the classroom teaching art after the pandemic. And so they continue to practice as artists professionally, but also training young children about art. And I think it needs to come off of a pedestal into everybody's domain where we're not judging the art, we're just enjoying the art and appreciating the expression involved.
I think so too. First, I want to say this book, Your Brain on Art. I've been talking also to many people about this during interviews as well, because of things that I discovered in the book or things that I've read, and also spoken to a few neuroscientists that's whose work is mentioned in the book. I think it's such an important book, and it's so wonderful that it's been in the hands of people that really are discussing, because I'm reading it now for the second time, just because there's so much information, and wonderful information that you don't want to miss.
Once you start to connect the dots, if you
Yeah,
will, between what is my brain for? What is it helping me to do? How do I tune that up? And it becomes a practice. I began watercolors 2 years ago, watercolor painting. And I'm finding that just pushing the color, the pigment around in the water, on the paper, is such a joyful experience and so calming that I now crave it. And
really.
I had never been been involved in that way, but it is for me very, very helpful, calming agent. And in the book, of course, it lets me know that I'll get a dopamine rush from that moment. That's what that feeling of, I feel better. My cortisol is just lowered, which is really, really, really important. That we don't let cortisol just overdo it. Cortisol is important and helpful to us in some situations, but long term can be very caustic and difficult for our health. So finding a way to manage myself that didn't involve the pressure of performing. When you're a paid performer, it's pressure to make sure you're absolutely ready, that I could just relax with and enjoy the process. That's what I think other people need to embrace and be encouraged to do. And if we can show children this in the context of neuroscience, maybe we'll have better neuroscientists in the future who are also
Exactly. Yeah.
healthy and expressive and arts focused.
Mm. I had a wonderful interview this morning with an artist from Nigeria, and he told me that when he was a child, they didn't have pen, like paper in the schools. They just had a little blackboard, like a board, and then they would write with chalk on it and then wipe it down afterwards so that the information was gone, always to the next lesson. And then he said, and what they also did in break time was they used to draw in the sand. They drew pictures in the sand with a little stick. But when break was over, the pictures were then removed, or you wouldn't see your picture again. And he said that sort of helped him to realize that it's part of the process, that every piece of art that you do, it's not necessarily it has to hang somewhere against the wall, or it has to be in a gallery, but it's the process of it, and it's the learning from it that you do. And exactly what you're talking about now, that just moving the paint, or just seeing the paint, seeing the colors and what happens with the colors, that's part of the important thing. But do you think we have just made it in this time where we also have social media, where everybody shows what they're doing, that we almost have this pressure of, you have to create something that you can show somebody?
I do. I absolutely do. And I've been thinking a lot about the false faces that we hide behind, and that in and of itself is exhausting. That we don't have to be perfect. We can be vulnerable.
Exactly.
And that's how we create relationships and we build trust and become understood and become understanding and compassionate. In order to do that, we need to allow ourselves to be honest with ourselves about what we're feeling, what we're experiencing, whether or not something causes us to feel stressed, to be conversational about these things. If we're not, we're at risk. And I think children are particularly subjected to this, because you think of them, they're born, they're tiny, they're learning to walk, they're learning where they're safe, they're learning where they're fed, they're learning
Yeah.
how to explore. And then all of a sudden they're told how to behave. Don't do this, don't do that, don't say this, be quiet. And they begin to suppress an awful lot of things. that they never even have words for. They carry that. We carry that from our own childhood. And I believe it is more prevalent than we want to admit. I believe it's fundamental to being human that we never go back and express those feelings or allow ourselves to forget the past and just be here in the present. Mandalas that Buddhists use in practice, there's beautiful, beautiful sand mandalas that Tibetan Buddhists in particular make are meant to be temporary works of art. They're meditations. And so this idea of drawing just to draw, just for the discipline of being still and quieting your mind and finding your peace, that's fundamental to that process. And instead, we turn it into an object, as you said. Let me show you what I have. Let me deliver you my content. Let me, how many likes did I get? None of which is authentic, right? It's not a true measure of who we are.
I'm thinking also now about these as also somebody that I spoke to, nature's art, or I can't remember exactly what the page was, but basically this guy goes out into nature and he makes art from leaves. He will stick leaves to it.
Yes. He's been here, and he does like willows and things like that. Yes, I know who he is. Yes, he did his last work here.
And then it disappears. I mean, if he goes away, he takes a picture, but then the leaves blow away, or it's just
yes.
And I've thought about that a lot after interviewing him. I thought, how does it feel if you spend all this time creating? Because sometimes he uses the tiniest leaves, make these patterns, and or he also does something on beaches, where he makes shapes in the sand, and then the water comes and it disappears. But this is this whole, just the feeling of this creation. Even if it disappears, it was that feeling that you created something.
It's true. And children do this automatically, don't they?
Yeah.
I mean, we have 47 miles of beach. I'm 5 minutes from the beach here. And when I grew up here, drawing in the sand, leaving a message, letting the waves wash it away is a constant. There's an expressive element of being left alone on the beach where I could do those things. And it didn't matter. Nobody was stopping me from letting out my creativity. Exactly. We're meant to do it that way. I believe that's true. And oftentimes I think as parents, we know to give a rich environment to our children for self-expression. They can finger paint or they can color. We put them in the kitchen and we stir things up and we make some cupcakes, or, we find ways of being creative to actually create. And we encourage that up until school. And then in school, I think I always thought of my children as really bright light bulbs, and my job was to keep that bright bulb, not let the world turn it down or dim it in any way. But I think in school, this emphasis on grades and particular measures comes into play, which brings me to the subject of measuring the impact of these kinds of arts experiences, which I think is real important and maybe the key to this dilemma. What if we could show measurably the impact of arts?
Absolutely.
That is fundamental to the definition of Neuroarts, because it's the measurable impact of arts and aesthetic experiences, which include nature, time in nature. That's an aesthetic experience. Think about birdsong and sitting on your porch under a tree and gazing at flowers in a garden. Those are very, very good for your brain because that's your natural environment. And if there was ever a place you belonged on the planet, it would be in nature, made for that, right? So learning to process this as healthy, how do I measure what just happened in my brain? Just thinking of it. What are the tools for that? And that's where the technology of today gets very exciting, because we can finally start to ask those questions and design those studies and really quantify and qualify very specifically some of the mechanisms and biomarkers that are directly the outcome of arts and aesthetic experiences.
And how do you how do you think this information, or how do you think the value of this of the arts and all this information can be brought to, say, parents, for example? Because I think parents are also under some pressure, because you think, I want to, you get sort of fed this idea, I have to give my children the best education. So they have to go to the top school where math, science, and languages are, the priority, because they have to go to university and they have to. So we sort of, parents have this push and this pressure to not take their children out and say, but nature is also important today. Today we have to just have a free time in nature.
Well, it depends on where you live and in what society that you raise your children as to what those pressures might be. I believe in Scandinavian countries, there's a whole movement, what Daniel's book, The Last Child in the Woods. Do you remember that? There was a whole school where children being out in the rain was how they learned about nature. So I'm seeing arts integrated teaching beginning to really grow and thrive. There's a school here in Palm Beach County called the Center for Creative Education, and it's kindergarten through fifth grade children, but they're immersed in a fully arts integrated curriculum for all subjects. Math is taught with art practices and creating things and making things and balancing things, not simply the abstract, disciplined on paper thinking, or even digitally, but it's haptic. It employs all of your brain. Your fingers have to move and look, your eyes have to see. Your brain has to process much more deeply the concepts when you're involved in making or mark making. As we've moved into keyboards as input devices for taking notes and doing our homework as students, we've moved away from handwriting. And handwriting, where you hold a pen and you're observing the paper and the flow of ink or pencil, is actually using another part of the brain at the same time that you're thinking. So it's a more complex kind of behavior. Now, yes, you're manipulating a keyboard, but you don't have the freedom. You know exactly what that letter is going to look like in that font on that screen, and you're not as involved in shaping that letter, in writing those words and remembering how they go. So think about that in terms of the complexity of the brain. And I often wonder, as we move into what I call it the cost of convenience. It's more convenient, it's very quick, it's easy, but it's at a cost of not being bothered, if you will, with slower technologies that are a lot more natural. And then nobody's writing in the sand anymore.
Yeah.
I'm not looking to the backward, but I'm saying, let's think about what the complex behaviors look like.
Do you know, I'm a notebook fan. I love, no, I sometimes just buy notebooks just because I love writing, writing by hand. And sometimes I feel maybe I'm so old fashioned because I still like to rather write than type, But now you're saying this, I think, well, this is probably it, because this is how I grew up. You made notes, you wrote and you made notes, and I love writing by hand. But it's probably that creative.
Didn't you, when you were a little girl and you were learning cursive handwriting, didn't you experiment with what your particular hand might be? Yes, it was a big deal.
Absolutely. I had a few different handwritings before I got to my signature handwriting that I have now. But I also, now that we talk about that, I've also realized that on days that I'm tired or not feeling, myself, or a little bit emotional, my handwriting absolutely shows it. I know when I can, sometimes I just think, oh, this is horrible writing, but then I realize, but it's because I'm tired, or so there's actually so much more around the handwriting part that we don't get.
The curious part of me, as I hear you say that, says, I wonder if you focused only on the handwriting for 15 or 20 minutes, if you
Mhm.
wouldn't feel better.
Exactly.
You know, I
Yes.
don't know. And the scientists, I was
I'm
good
going
at
to,
science.
yeah,
So
I'm
I'm
going
not
to
just, a
try.
music person, but I think that it's worthy of an experiment being designed
Yeah.
around things like that, so that we do explore both sides of the question. Am I just tired and therefore stuck being tired? Or is there a way out of this
Mm,
that can reset a natural order to the way my neurons are firing in my brain? Do I only have a nap or quit work as a choice, or do I have something I can actually proactively do, if you will, as a band-aid, as a sort of a temporary fix until I can get that nap that my brain is asking for, or until I can take care of the problem that caused the stress? What is that self-care piece? And almost always it's going to be something that is expressive and arts expressive. Now, in a more, there are so many layers to this, but in a world where people are looking to reduce stress in their lives, sometimes they go for counseling. They want to really unpack, why am I carrying around this piece of stress, this big rock inside of me? And they need some professional assistance for that. Or they may have a mental illness that is impacting the way their brain fires. This can be, through the hands of a licensed therapist, a very, very helpful tool, because it is really a universal.
mm,
Whether that is handwriting, or whether they're just drawing pictures that tell a story, or, however, listening to music or making music. And my understanding through the neuroscience is that it's as effective whether you're simply receiving, like art gazing, just looking and staring at
yeah.
something beautiful can be very calming. So as a receiver, it can be helpful and effective in lowering cortisol and releasing dopamines, because you're getting pleasure from what you're looking at instead of stress. So it works both ways. You can either practice it and express it, or you can seek out a great playlist and take five and just a couple of deep breaths, and feel better. So, I mean, why walk around with that rock? Relieve the stress a little bit.
Exactly. Mm. I do. Now that you mention that, I'm just thinking this is why there's this one beautiful church here in Vienna, and I tend to, when I feel a little bit stress, or when sometimes you just have that feeling, and I go into this church because the interior is very baroque interior. But I always, when I go in, I discover something new or something that I haven't seen or realized that's there, because it's so filled with all these beautiful, the architecture. And I think this is exactly what you're talking about. It's that observing rather than doing. You can also get that feeling from just observing.
Absolutely true.
Mm,
You get it, because we're made to observe, and you're observing order and pattern and
mm.
surfaces and details, but you're safe. There's nothing going
Yeah,
to come out and hurt you there. So I
exactly.
think that
That's
that's the
nice.
beauty of what you're describing, is you found a place to go to. When I was little, I would climb a banyan tree in my yard. and,
Oh,
and I
really?
would, yeah, I would climb up in this tree. And I mean, like, maybe 10 years old, little girl, and sit up in the tree and sit very still. And then my imagination, which was free to roam, would imagine that birds would come to visit me, like in Cinderella.
Yeah,
I would
yeah.
think of these little stories, and the little birds would come. And sure enough, birds would come. And I would sit in that tree in the shade and feel the breeze and wonder what it's like to be a bird. And look at how funny their little movements are. So I gave myself naturally, not knowing all of the sort of wiring of our brains details. I wasn't burdened by that at all. It was natural, but I think that sort of proves that we're made to do this in a way. I wonder if it isn't so. That it was part of living on the planet. I was connected to nature. I was in a safe place, and I could just let my imagination run wild and ponder all sorts of things. Now, you do that when you go to a Baroque cathedral or church or beautiful construction. Design plays a major role in our mental health, whether we're stressed by the design because the walls are gray, and the lighting is dim, and the furniture is bland and dreary, and there's nothing cheerful. Or we put lots of plants in there, we open a window, we paint the walls a bright color, we put some art on the walls. Then all of a sudden, it becomes something we can connect to and feel related to. So our surroundings are another way that Neuroarts can address that. And there have been, I think, some psychology studies, but they don't that look at environment. Do you learn better in an enriched, art-filled environment? Do you learn better in nature, outdoors? A recent study did this, or is it just the same if you're in a very gray, ordinary room? If we were to expand on that, what are we measuring? Are we measuring the outcome, which is, did they learn better? Did they learn faster? What are we measuring? Or is there a way to put an EEG device on their head or do a galvanic skin response and get other data points? That's where the technology becomes very, very interesting, because we might not have a complete set of answers yet. And this is how directing the research foundation for Neuroarts becomes a really relevant topic. Then it can be translated into careers, into people who go out in the world who understand this deeply and develop practices that can be replicated and taught to parents, taught to older people, taught to people in the workplace. So we see that that's what growing a community of health would look like at the global level.
That's amazing. Well, you're doing such amazing work, really, and also, I mean, you said you wrote to me that you're thinking outside the box, but you really are. I mean, I can, from our conversation, it's so positive.
Thank you. The box is the problem.
Okay.
I think the box is the problem that we have constructed, and we believe in the box. And what if you didn't? What if you look beyond the box to what else is possible? Yeah. I think that is what is so exciting about this field. And my role in it is very minimal. I'm just an advocate of it in many, many ways. A musicologist, I can do historical and archival research, and I can also read NIH studies from neuroscientists, and digest that information. But there are better people than me to do that, and their research is sometimes held back by different sets of priorities and different funding opportunities. So this conversation to create demand for this and to say, wait a minute, we're human beings and we're not well. How do we get well? And at all stages of our lives, how do we build resilience to stress? How do we overcome trauma? How do we thrive? How do we create a better, more peaceful world? Those are the big questions we're all facing. But it all starts at an individual level, and it also starts by breaking down the box.
Yeah.
Taking ourselves out of it a little bit and saying, I'm an artist. If, for example, in my community, we have a very, very rich cultural community. I'm talking to you and you're in Vienna, so I say that might seem laughable because you're centuries of incredible art and culture in Vienna. It's just a way of life. We have a thriving artist community, which is seen as a sector. And that in and of itself is language of separation. And the artists don't feel responsible or compelled necessarily to learn the neuroscience of what they're doing in order to be better art teachers. So how do we create conversations that make people curious and make them want to talk to each other? And how do you get neuroscientists who are really interested in what the artists have in the way of insights into how this might be realized into a study that yields very helpful results? There's a really beautiful frontier there. So that's my hope, is that we can just create those connections. I do a lot of Zooming and a lot of sitting at home making connections and introductions between people and trying to come up with the way that conversation can be pursued. And I do that on behalf of my client, which is Palm Health Foundation. So I'm honored to be part of your conversation.
Wow.
Part of Susan Mag Salmon and the International Arts and Minds Lab at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore and the Aspen Institute. They're the co-directors of the Neuroarts Blueprint. And so we are a local community coalition of that larger network. And that large network, I think, is going to surprise people, is how much this conversation is growing.
Well, you've also just simplified everything, because you showed that, I mean, we were talking about all these things, but you showed that it's those little things, it's not the huge, it's not that you have to study 10 years of music or 10 years of art to be able to use art to the benefit of your brain. It's those little things that you do, and just enjoying, and that going back to the natural instincts in a human being.
Yes, to realize that the fear was back then, whatever it was that imprinted on you and made you trigger stress now that you're 20, 30, 40 years older, was back then. And today, you don't need to do that. And if you feel the stress, you can respond in a more productive way to relieve the stress and the anger and grudges or whatever it is that one might carry and might be coloring their view of the world today to a better view. That's philosophical, I realize, but I think there's some of that in here too.
No, definitely. But Bama, what is the dream for you, or what is the great wish?
I am at the end of my working life. So this is the most meaningful work I've ever done. Mostly because it's very behind the scenes. So my dream would be to see the people on the forefront joining hands and really seriously looking at an art-centric explanation for healing. Studying some of the ideas that, I mean, Your Brain on Art, that book, those are studies already done. So grow that. So ultimately, I'd love to see it as, I think, like you're thinking, where it's taught to parents, it's taught in schools, and art as a health, a healing modality throughout our lives becomes well known, becomes well understood. Not woohoo, not but really logical and understood through science, which is a lens of testing. That's all it is a way of learning. And so we don't put science on a pedestal either. We just say either it does or it doesn't. That's what science tells us. And it does. It does help us heal. It does lower stress. It does help us to overcome difficulties. It also helps us regain our memory and dance at the concert and have joy in our lives and enjoy nature. And it helps us do an awful lot of things by studying this field of neuroarts, in the sense that it's a combination of art and science through technology, so we can take those measurements. And the other part of my dream would be that taking those measurements became a priority.
Oh, yeah.
That's how we build a body of evidence even further. And then the conversations are, what might we try? And a lot of the inhibitions might go away too. Oh, I can't sing. Yes, you can.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes, you can.
Yeah, and if I think, when I was a child, my parents they were a group of friends. I think it was about 5 couples, and I can remember when we all got together, and the children were, all the couples had children, and we were all got together, and after a evening of eating or braaiing, I'm from South Africa, then one of the men, he used to play the piano, and all the adults would stand around the piano singing, and we would be there as well, also singing along if we knew the songs, but listening. It was always this entertainment, and I think it's not done anymore. People don't do this anymore. But I can remember as a child, that was always this thing. When we all got together, there was always that at the end of the night, the adults used to sing. And not one of them had huge voices or were opera singers or anything. They were just our parents singing. And it would have been so great if this would be a normal thing for people to do.
to do once again folk songs, villages
Yes.
having their own
Yes.
songs, people singing at celebrations.
Mm.
These are all examples of peace, examples of community and society that are arts infused and arts based and very self expressive and very related to our identity. And if we can return to that context, which human beings have always done, you
Yes.
know, this is our relics from history, our drawings on cave walls at
Absolutely.
Lascaux. But we have to remember who we are. And who we are is artists, artful beings. And we can use that knowledge. But in a world that prioritizes science and technology right now, art holds its own. It's the key that needs to unlock it is the science and the technology. So
Absolutely.
I'm very excited about the field and hopeful that it will continue. I'm putting a lot of effort into it locally now, but my vision would be local
Mm.
to see that thrive and grow and continue to lead the way forward as a community. Because I think that's where the real value is through the schools, through the universities, through the research institutions we have here, through our healthcare systems, through our behavioral health networks, you know, that we in our families, in our homes, in our individual apartments, that these become widely embraced daily practices.
Exactly. Bama, I believe in the power of one, and you are definitely somebody that, you started and you do your thing and you do the work, and I just believe in the power of one.
My goodness, what a nice thing to say.
Yeah,
Thank
no,
you.
absolutely.
Such a joy to meet you.
It was so lovely to talk to you. I feel so inspired, and I will always now think of you when I do my handwriting in my notebooks,
I'll
because
think of you too.
you've
My
just
pen.
really, I'm not going to do it really more, because this is not old fashioned. This is so important for my brain now. Now I realize it.
And that's why you're smiling. Look at that, you know. It brings you joy. And we need to
Absolutely.
listen to that. Yeah.
Yeah.